Hi everyone, my name is Tsvetelina, but everyone calls me T for short. I've been working with Grace since 2012 and I do lots of different things, but I also work on the Homecoming live show and I've done multiple shows for the last 7 or 8 years. So I'm going to talk about some fundamentals of live shows and then I'll talk through my process on some of the shows that I've worked on, and most of it is case studies that go from mood board to real life, and then I'll talk about some of my learnings. So this is me. As I said, I do a bunch of different things, but in 2016, Grace called me and she said, "Hiya, we've got a show in Barcelona in a week and we need to make some visuals." So I basically had to learn how to use Resolume, which is a visual software, in a week and make the visuals. And then I did that show and it was amazing. So that's where, that's kind of how I started. It was never really planned. It was something that I did that I found really, really exciting. And so 2016 was actually a really pivotal year. We were working with Skepta and he had quite a few big shows, but one of the biggest shows and the most pivotal moment that made me really excited and really want to work on live shows was Alexandra Palace, where we worked with a really visionary lighting designer called Tobias Rylander. He's still to this day one of my favorite lighting designers and creative directors for live, and kind of like sitting in the dark in Alexandra Palace, which is like a huge 10,000 people venue in London. It's really iconic. But sitting in the dark and kind of like watching Tobias Rylander program that show really made me want to do the same. And so the show was really iconic because, number one, because of the venue, number two, because of its capacity, number three, because it really put it kind of like clashed two creatives in terms of Tobias, who's like an incredibly precise, incredibly graphic designer, with Skepta, who at the time was still very much into and an ambassador for grime. And also another reason why that show was really iconic was because at the time he couldn't travel to America, so the show was live streamed. So we had to make sure that it was super iconic. So yeah, as I said, a lot of graphic lines. The stage was absolutely huge. One thing that was really, really cool about it was that a few years earlier, Ali Pali, there was a fire accident in there, but they allowed us to put a car on fire on stage, which was a lot of fun. Obviously, there was no fuel in the car, etc., and it was all pyrotechnics, but that was a really exciting and iconic moment, and that's how the show ended. So that was kind of the start of me wanting to be involved and to work on live shows. So then, fundamentals. If you're an artist or you work on an artist's team or you work as a creative, I think oftentimes, depending on budget, it's always a big question of what do I spend my budget on and what's the most important thing. And I would always say the first thing that you should invest in is audio. Who's the sound engineer that you're working with? What's the sound like in the venue? Do you have time to rehearse? Those things are really, really important. So I think even if you have a small budget, the first thing you should invest it in is sound and rehearsals. Then lighting is another crucial part. Again, even if you don't have a big budget, you can still spend a little bit of budget towards a lighting operator, towards programming your show so that all of the cues work with the music. Some of my favorite shows that I've been to don't have visuals, don't have pyros, but the lighting and the sonics work really, really well hand in hand. So even that is enough to take people on a journey. And you can have like signature colors that you use and looks and moods that you can build with the lighting. Then visuals is another key part. Obviously, the more things you start adding, the more expensive shows tend to get. but it's always really good to find young creatives and to build relationships with people. Then, of course, you can work with set, you can work with levels, you can work with so many different things like inflatables and custom built sets. And then again, if you have, I'm trying to consider kind of like thinking about budget as well. Special effects is always another good investment to make. Even if you don't have a huge budget, having one or two key moments in your show where you can have like confetti or flames or some sort of explosion. It's really important to have things like that to kind of bring people back and to have peaks in terms of your show. So if you look at your show as a timeline, it's kind of like a movie as well. You need to be building towards something. You need to be working towards something. So it's always important to kind of like ease your audience into it and then continue building. Then team fundamentals. Obviously, as an artist, you would have your management team, but then another really important person on your team is your tour manager. That's the person who's doing all of your advancing and making sure that everything's ready for you once you arrive. Again, audio engineer is you are a young artist or you're working with a young artist and it's possible to afford it. So it's super important to have an audio engineer that you get on with and that understands you, especially if you're working with somebody who has a really unique sound. A good production manager is crucial and can make sure that your show goes in and out on time, that budget is saved, that deals are made with people, and that you have a really successful show altogether. A tour or a show can be made or broken by a production manager, so it's really important to have a good production manager in your team. And then there's obviously the creative team, from whether you work with a creative director or not, to the person who creates your visuals, and your VJ, the person who does your lighting, the person who does your set. So those are all really important people in your team. And then across that, there are actually tens, hundreds of thousands of people that can work on shows and tours. Then I wanted to talk a little bit about festival versus headline shows. So festival shows are often outdoors. You often don't have necessarily, sometimes you do, sometimes you don't have control over your performance, but people often wonder what to invest their budget in when you have a festival show that's outdoors. And I think a really important thing to think about is your show during the daytime or is your show during the nighttime? Because that will once again dictate where you spend your budget. So, for example, if your show is during the daytime, you need to, first of all, you need everyone's production documents and you need to know what the festival's already providing. So most of the time festivals have relatively decent lighting rigs, but lighting is not necessarily the best thing to invest in on a daytime festival show. Yes, if budget is available, and yes, if it's quite close to the crowd, and yes, if it's punchy and can make a really, really big impact, but you probably want to be thinking more about your visuals because that's what would make a bigger impact in a daytime show. Whereas when you get to headline shows, when you get to your own shows, then it's a lot easier to dictate the parameters of your show and what works. So I'm just going to talk through a couple of examples. So in 2016, Skepta performed at Glastonbury, and Grace found, I hope this is the right reference, Grace. Grace was really kind of like obsessed with this artist's chandelier of CCTV cameras. And so we actually built a structure that was inspired by that for Glastonbury, and we worked a lot with our visuals team. So all of these things were things that were visible to the crowd in terms of the structure, and then all of the visuals reflected that, where they all of the visuals were pushed through these CCTV frameworks that we created for the show. And then that was a daytime show, and those were the elements that we considered bringing in. However, this is another festival show. This is an evening show. And again, you can kind of see the difference with that. With this show, we built this, Skepta started kind of getting really into this industrial world. So we built like this huge industrial fan, and the set was entirely made up of lots of different pipes. Another really important thing for festivals is you always have IMAGs. So that's to the central screen, that's always another element that can be added to the show. So those IMAGs can be treated, or you can be projecting different visuals to it, but it's always really important to make sure that what's on the side screen is complementary to what's on the main screens, because it just allows an additional platform. So there's just some additional images from that. And then moving into your own headline shows and tours, that's where you're really in control from the kinds of venues that you want, that you choose to perform in. So on this tour, the brief was really, really industrial, small, intimate venues. And again, you control everything from the lighting to the people that you choose to collaborate with for your merchandise or the clothes that you wear on stage. And then this
I'm a man.
This industrial era kind of led into a takeover of huge space in Manchester for Manchester International Festival, where we explored what a rave of the future could look like. So we had 3 tunnels with different experiences that opened up at different points in the night, until you got to the final point where there was a stage in the center of the space, and he was hidden in the stage. So when the show started, you never really saw him. You just saw him on stage. And the best thing about one of the great things about this is we worked with lots of amazing creative people. The stage was really interesting and something that he'd never done before, although I would have to say stages in the round are actually sometimes one thing that we learned from this is stages in the round can sometimes be I suppose tricky to navigate as well, because you have to really work your way around the stage to make sure that you're engaging with people from all sides. But one of the really special things about this show was that no one was allowed to have their phones in. So this is actually one of my favorite images, because you can't go to a show these days and not see hundreds of phones in front of you. And I think that's another really important thing to bear in mind as well, is I'm a really big fan of reveals and openings at shows, but it's really difficult to do that these days because people know when the artist is coming on stage, and so they anticipate it, but then that means that everyone has their phones with their flash on. And so if you're trying to do a reveal, the stage will always be alight. You can never really get complete darkness. So that's one thing to bear in mind. But yeah, this was kind of where that industrial era wrapped up. But I wanted to show this just to kind of show the progress of how that went from festival to tour to headline to then a complete exploration of a theme for your performance. So then moving on to this, I wanted to show a little case study around Santi. This is one of the first projects that I worked on independently. And the reason why I love this project so much is because I knew he had a show in London. I knew him. I kind of had this vision for a show which was based around a shrine. And I really loved Santi's aesthetic. So I looked into different kinds of shrine. I really looked into VHS, video art and installation, and I looked at people like Namjoon Paik over there. That's considered one of the first video installations. And so I put this mood board together and I showed it to him, and he was like, "Let's go for it." And so I was like, "Wow, this wasn't as kind of like, as scary as I thought, to put an idea together, to share it with someone you admire." And then we were able to move forward with it. So this is what the show ended up looking like. We had this archway through which he walked that acted as the centerpiece for the show. We had palm trees, and we had all of these old TVs through which we pumped the visuals. So that's a little bit what that show ended up looking like. And then we actually took this show that he did in London, his first ever London headline show. He took the show to Lagos, so we did an iteration of it at Hard Rock Cafe, and we still maintained some of the elements from it. But the really fun thing that we did was we actually had a videographer, and we invited lots of Santi's friends who kind of became characters in the show. So everyone would come out and change during different parts of the set, and then they would be filmed. So the videographer would walk around with the camera on stage and through the crowd, and then those were the visuals in real time that were showing on the screen. So that was a really, really fun night. And I think one thing that I learned with this is never be late. When you said you're going to send something, send it at the time you say you're going to send it, because that will then affect a lot of other people's planning, and you may run into trouble. The more time you have with live shows, the better it is for various different reasons. The more time you have, the further your budget will stretch. The less time you have, the more money you sometimes have to end up throwing at a show or at an event to make it work. So it's always great to plan forward. And especially after COVID, crews are booked and busy, crews aren't available. So the less time you have, the more you'll have to work with people who are not necessarily your top people that you want to work with. So a really important thing to remember is sometimes there's someone that you really, really want to work with, work together and work early and engage people and creatives at an early stage. So this next show is Mahalia. So I hadn't worked with Mahalia before, and I didn't really know her that well. So in preparation for the show, I watched every single video that she'd done, every single interview. I scrolled all the way to the bottom of her Instagram, and I kind of picked out things that I resonated with. And that image on the right-hand side is the main image that inspired me in terms of her set. So I put 3 different mood boards together of 3 different routes. I presented it to them, and this is the route that they picked that then turned into the show. So I was looking at how can I bring her world onto stage. So at the time, she was really posting things that had materials that had a lot of texture, just a lot of just fabrics and just really beautiful, airy spaces. So these are some of the mood boards that I pulled together in terms of color and in terms of texture. And then that became this technical drawing, which is the stage design. So I really wanted it to feel like she's embraced by the stage and embraced by the lighting and embraced by all of the elements, and that there was a central piece for her to use. So there was a circularizer for her and her band. So these are all of the technical drawings. Then these are all of the renders that we produced before the show. And so I really wanted to show this. So this is in essence my show document, and there's 2 different ways to do show documents. I always do a visual show document, and I always do a Google Sheets show document, which I'll show a little bit later. But where I was saying you need to think about your show as a timeline, this is what I mean. So I always put the set list on a timeline, and I always put what's what color, where you have pyro, any additional notes in terms of what's happening in your show. So for me, this is a really good way to see the show without necessarily seeing the show, because then this way you can tell, oh, we're using too much of the same color together. We're using maybe too many pyros are all in one slot. So this is a really basic, rudimentary way for you to be able to see what your show is going to look like. And then when I'm briefing the lighting designer or when I'm briefing someone else, I always kind of go track by track. And first of all, I tend to, so this is the lighting designer's brief, but I tend to really go by intuition. So I'll listen to the set list and I'll go from top to bottom and just write quick notes. And I always set myself a deadline and a time lock. So by the time that the song that I'm listening to has run out, that's the time that I've got to put all of the information that I want on that song. And then you do that multiple times and add more details and more details. So you'll have things like the lighting, what the SFX are, where the artist is positioned, So, yeah, this is what a show document or a lighting brief looks like for me. Then this is images from what the show looks like in real life. And I really wanted to show this particular project because what I love about live shows is that you really only have one shot at the show. Obviously, when you're on tour, etc., you have a lot of time to perfect the show, but sometimes you don't have that opportunity. And as I said, I really love intros. So with this particular show, we had a kabuki curtain, which is a curtain that it's kind of like an automated curtain that drops down. And during sound check, we tested this 3 times, and all 3 times it worked. And then when it came to the live show, I remember going and checking with the pyro guys, and I was like, guys, please, I need to make sure that this is the opening moment. It's like one of the biggest moments in the show, so I really, really need to make sure that this works. And they were kind of like, oh, we do this all the time. Don't worry, it's going to be absolutely fun. And I was like, oh, this doesn't sound good. And lo and behold, the kabuki curtain didn't drop at the cue when it was supposed to drop. And I think a learning from this was, at the time, I was just absolutely mortified, and I felt so awful. And I think I watched that show with a really disappointed eyes. And it wasn't until, I kind of started seeing the pictures and all the videos and all of the things that my friends were sending me. It was a few days later that I was like, oh my goodness, this was actually a really, really good show. And she really loved it and she really enjoyed it. But she was amazing and she totally managed to save it. She just walked out the curtain from the back and carried on performing. So it was fine. But it's just kind of like things will inevitably go wrong at live shows. And you just kind of have to accept that and be prepared for that and be able to just move on and work through it. So that was my big learning on this project. Then in 2022 at Homecoming, I met Central C, and that year he was going on tour. The tour was called Still Loading, and so we presented some of the work that we'd done previously. I really, really wanted to work with him, and so we had a call. I think it was early September, and their tour started in October. So we're going to talk about this a little bit in a second, but we had a very, very short space of time to be able to pull this tour together. So again, this is mood boards and research. So what we were looking at was, again, things that make up Central C's world. And we were really looking at things like estate buildings and blocks and really things that have, I was really interested in volume and recreating these, the sense of buildings through the screens and staging. So this is, again, my show document I'm going to take you through. So this is a very small fraction of a very long research document that included lots of different things, but then this turned into the show. So these are the renders for the show. I used a semi-transparent screen so that we could position the lighting behind it. The screen had a return on it, as you'll see in some of the other images. The lighting was really blocky and, again, quite chunky. And as you can see, the screen, I wanted the screen to kind of feel like buildings. And instead of having traditional IMAX, we placed the IMAX on the stage to complement the central screen. I always love it when people consider the audience and the lighting extends beyond the stage into the crowd. So these are the renders that we produced for that show. Then again, here's my show document. Again, thinking about all of the different moments of the show. The intro for me is really important. How your show starts, how you gauge people's excitement. As I said, I think it's always really important to have a peak moment towards the beginning and then continue building towards a crescendo moment. So there were lots of fun things in this show. Again, this is how I explain to everybody, to all the different teams, to lighting, to cameras, to video, to management, to any brand partners, what the show is going to look like. So as this show was live streamed, the guys actually filmed Sench's walk to stage, and then he kind of got on this riser behind the screen. And we did the reveal while he was behind the screen. So this is all of the briefing that we had to go through with him in terms of what he had to do and what would happen. And so he really wanted to make an introduction film that was filmed in the area that he lived in with his friends, and he did a really amazing voiceover on the film that really explained where he was at that time, and that really, really set the tone for the show. So while that intro film was playing, he walked onto this riser that lifted him, can't remember how high into the air, but it was pretty high. And then that switches over and it revealed him. I'll show you in a moment. But again, this is what the document looks like, and it has all of the visuals. Usually this document will also have all of the lighting cues and all of the pyro cues, but this one specifically didn't need that. And then the great part was that the crew used the same riser. So we did a crew reveal towards the end of the show as well, where his friends were able to join him on stage. Again, I include everything in my show documents so that it's really, really clear, so that if anyone's looking at this that isn't 100% familiar with these things, it's a really clear guide of what's going to happen at the show. And then this is a different version of the show document, which is a lot simpler. So for example, this is what the pyro guys want to see, because it's really clear what's happening at each stage of the show. So I don't know if you can see this, but it goes from the track to what the BPM is, what the main lighting or color is. It explains what the visual is. It explains what's on the IMAGs. Then it also has any production notes. So all of those things like walking to stage, what's happening on the riser, at what point he gets off the riser, etc. To then what the pyro cue is, to then what pyros we have and what the pyro cue is. So I always do two different documents because they serve two very, very different purposes. And so this is what, I might not play the full video, but this is what that headline show looked like. And this was at Alexandra Palace. So this was a very 360 moment for me, from that first time that I sat in there with Tobias Rylander to then being able to design a show that went in the same venue. So I worked with a really, really amazing team, and because we had such a short time to turn this around, I worked with the best production manager I could find. She's really amazing, and she also worked with us in that 2016 show. So it's really important to build relationships with people. When you find people that get the job done, always try and work with them. I think with creatives, it's a little bit different. You sometimes want to push and you want to go in different directions. So find the people that can execute that vision at the level that you want. So this is what that reveal moment looked like. With him behind the stage, a lot of the visuals were kind of rendered to utilize the fact that the screen was supposed to look like a building. And then this is the finale of that show. So I think learnings from this show were always insist on knowing what the budget is. It's always really great for when people say, think blue skies, and sometimes that really happens. With this project specifically, I definitely felt like a kid on a playground, and I was really allowed to just experiment and try things out, and those guys really, really trusted me. But I think one thing that slowed us down was we didn't know what the budget was from the beginning, so it was kind of like guesswork. Oh, can we go really far, or do we have to rein it in? So it always is very, very helpful when you know the budget, or when you have an estimate of what the talent and their team are prepared to spend. I work with the mindset that no matter what the budget is, you can do something fun and you can use it in a really, really impactful way. So then I worked with those guys again in last year in the summer for their Glastonbury performance. And again, these are what the mood boards looked like. So I was really looking at Central, really wanted the visuals. I only worked on the visuals for the summer run, but Central C really wanted to feel reflected and represented in his visuals and to really take it back to basics. So I really looked at, again, lots of silhouettes, went back to this idea of estate buildings. And so again, these are the mood boards. And then I worked with lots of different people to create the visuals. So I worked really closely with Central C's manager on this project. And so he was kind of like, we were listening to this song, which ended up being the opening song for that tour called Khabib. And he was like, I really see an eagle for this visual. And I kept thinking, because we kept going back and forth around this estate look. So it was like, why don't we just do an eagle flying through an estate? So this is kind of where that visual came from. So this was the opening visual for Glastonbury. And then this is, don't know if you can hear the sound. I'm not going to play the full visual. But then this is what the actual visual looks like. And this is the visual on stage. Again, daytime show or afternoon show. So the lighting was quite stroby, really blocky and quite big so that it can make an impact. And then another visual that I worked on was this infinity loop through an estate. So we came up with different scenarios that would happen in an apartment block. And we created this infinite travel through the estate. I don't know why the audio is not working. And you see all of these different scenarios. So it's quite stripped back in a way, but he's somebody who really, really wanted to not have too much going on behind him and more so a mood and a world while he's performing. So that's why I tried to keep things as simple as possible in certain instances. And then with a lot of the visuals in that project, there was this continuous theme of travel, of moving through different spaces. And so that's the visual. I'm not going to play the full song because I don't know how much time I have left. And again, that's how the visual was made and the visual on stage. One thing that I learned through this process and throughout this project was sometimes you may not get the opportunity to speak to an artist, and it's because of various different things. Not because they don't want to speak to you. Maybe they're recording, maybe they're in a different headspace. So always push, if you're working as a creative, always push to understand what the artists want. And it can be 3 key words that you can build from. But I feel like with this project, we started in a totally different space and a totally different mood. And it ended up being something completely different. But again, you're always against time with shows. So it's really important to get it right at the beginning. And I feel like, not because of this project, but sometimes artists feel a pressure to know everything. And sometimes that's not their job to have all of the references and to have exactly what they want in their head. Some artists do and some artists don't necessarily, and it's also okay to say that, but I think it's really important to just work with key words that can then help you build a mood from that. And then I spelled study wrong here. And then I really wanted to talk about the Homecoming live show. This show is one of my favorite shows that I work on every year. We started in 2018, and Grace had this idea that where she wanted the show to work like a playlist. So everyone performs their biggest hits back to back, and artists come out in a really quick succession. So over the years that we've been developing the show, there's a few key things that I always like to maintain when working on the show, and that's always to have a fun way for artists to enter the stage. The reason why the show is so exciting is because we release the lineup, but you never know what order people are going to come out in. So the entrance is always really important. I always really try to extend the lighting to the room and to make sure that people feel engaged and are part of the experience. So you'll see throughout the years we built, this was 2018, this was the first ever show that we did here. But you'll see how 2022 and 2023, the way that the stage was built was so that the audience can be part of the show, with the lighting and screens extending into the audience and the audience being underneath it. So yeah, as I said, this was 2018. I really had an amazing time creating bespoke visuals for all of the artists that were on the lineup, and that was amazing because when I sat down with people like Wavy or Santi and Adunsi and I showed them the visuals, and they couldn't believe that I'd make bespoke visuals for each and every one of them, and that was just such a special moment. And I think that really kind of helped a lot of people to just push and experiment how they can communicate their world to their audience. That was a really fun year. Naomi Campbell actually opened that show, and lots of people came out, people that weren't on the bill, and it was really, really amazing. This is 2019. Rema performed for the first time at that show. That's the first time that I ever used screens above the audience. One thing about working on shows here, it's always really, really important to be present while the stage is being built. And just in general, it's really important to be present because problems or you will run into things that need to be solved on the spot. So it's really important for you to be there to work with the team to help execute your vision. This was what our show looked like in 2022. Again, as I said, really continuing this idea of engaging the crowd, immersing the crowd, making sure that the audience feel really, really close to the talent and vice versa, that the talent can feel like they have a really intimate show with the audience. This was last year's show. And then this year, I was really inspired by this exhibition that I saw in London, which was called Beyond the Streets, which was a amazing retrospective of street and graffiti art, and they spoke about this creative troupe. So I was really inspired by a group of people coming together to create something unique, and people that may not have necessarily worked together before. So I'm really, really lucky that this year I was able to work with all of these incredible artists from Lagos, other countries across Africa and the diaspora to create the visuals for the show. So everyone has submitted a piece of their work, and then I worked with a visuals team to create the visuals, and that's what the show is going to be made up of on Sunday. So hopefully everyone that's here can come and see the show on Sunday. So that's my talk. Thank you. Thanks, guys. Hopefully some of you guys have questions too.
Hi, I'm Karim.
Hi.
It's quite astonishing, like the amount of work that goes into like making a show. Like I would have never imagined it like as a true art form. I have two questions actually. Like, how long does it take to actually plan a show? Like from when like you put out draft, or like, okay, this is what you're doing, till when the show date actually comes up. And for shows that have multiple performers and headliners, like how do you simplify the production? Because if this amount of work can go into just one person like Central C or Skepta, like when you have about like 8 different artists that have like their own like type of vibe and aesthetic, like how do you simplify that for them?
Sure. So it tends to vary. It depends when the artist's team get in touch with you. Sometimes I've had to pull shows together in a week. I remember one year Wizkid called Grace and asked for some support on his O2 show. So we pretty much had a week to pull the visuals for the entire show together. And again, that's how I worked, super intuitively, like listening to the song. He had some ideas, Grace had some ideas, I had some ideas. So we just pulled all of that together, and then I worked with a really, really strong team that I knew could deliver in that time. And you just have to really be able to build a good team around you in order to be able to do that. In an ideal world, you want to be able to have at least 4 to 6 months before the start of your tour or before the start of your show, but that rarely happens. However, people like Beyonce, people like Kendrick Lamar, those guys, like Beyonce works on her shows up to 2 to 4 years ahead of time, and she knows she knows where every single camera is, she knows where every single light is, she knows what every single visual is. So I think that it really tends to vary, and it depends on different things. It depends on what you've been currently working on. It depends on what other priorities you have at that time when you get in touch with people. But the really important thing, and to work efficiently, is speak with the artist, know what they want, or make sure that the person that you're being briefed by really understands them and can help answer those questions, because that would really help speed up the process. In reality, it tends to be between a month and 2 months, but most of the time it tends to be about a month. So in terms of process, I would say if I have like 2 months, I'd probably spend a week to 2 weeks kind of like pulling some initial concepts together, running those through with artists and management, making adjustments, and then in the meantime, you're building the team on the side. Who's the production manager? And then those guys will work with who's your lighting supplier, who's your video supplier, who's your screen supplier, etc. One thing that's really important, and if at all possible, is people spend months in pre-programming. Obviously, sometimes that can be really expensive. So if you don't have the time, I would say the minimum amount of time you want to spend doing that is at least 3 to 5 days if you can. So that's really important. And then your second question was, how do you simplify it when you have more than one artist? So with the Homecoming show, for example, we actually have between 35 and 45 artists that turn around per show, which is really fun and super intense. But the way that we make that work is, again, first of all, we have a team who we trust explicitly from the people. I saw Toby. Toby books all of the talent and calls the show and works with the artists backstage to make sure that everyone's on stage at the time that they need to be on stage on. But one thing that I do from the front of house side, looking at the show, is I usually have, in the beginning, I would create bespoke visuals for each artist. But as the years have progressed and the lineup has become bigger and bigger, what I tend to do is I have a bank of visuals that I use that can be used as moods, and I use the Homecoming graphics to create additional visuals. So that's my bank that I have that I use for, let's say, 40% of the show. And so if something unpredictable happens, or if a special guest comes last minute, I have something that I can always go to on screen. And then the other thing that tends to happen is artists will either get in touch in advance and say that they want to work on their own visuals. And so I work with them to support them through that process. And what tends to happen is when we do sound check, a lot of people have already made their visuals, or they have previous visuals that they want to use, and they give those to us. But the way that I keep that really organized is through Google Sheets. So I have a spreadsheet that has all of the performing artists, what visual we're using for them, and or if we have a visual for them, or if we don't. And then I work with the visuals and the lighting team to build the show and to build the project. So I try and build it in a way where anything that can happen, we're prepared for. And then once the show starts, I get information from backstage, who the person coming on stage next is, so that then I can prepare the crew that I work with to load that correct visual. But just staying really, really organized and working with each talent and their team as much as you can. I hope that answers your question. Okay, I can only answer one more question.
Hello.
So my question is for shows and festivals where you have multiple headline artists and their set design is like really big. What's the process between the change from each artist to the next? What's that process like? Are the stages or the sets, are they pre-built? Or like, I just want to know what that process, because I know the time between, the time change is usually really slim, 15, 10 minutes. So I want to know like, how do they put the next person's stage together right after the other person's performance?
So the way that it usually works with most festivals is you have a big headliner who's pretty much, not always, but most of the time, it's the headliner or the person before the headliner who are kind of allowed to have a bit more of an elaborate production on stage. And so those changeovers can be a little bit longer. Sometimes changeovers can be from 20 minutes to half an hour to 40 minutes to an hour. And that goes for festivals that have multiple stages. So you can go from one stage to the next while there's a changeover. Things do tend to be pre-built and they're on rolling risers with wheels. So things get rolled onto stage and locked into place. And so there's usually a huge holding area behind the stage where those things go. And when you have multiple, when you have that for multiple artists, things are kind of like pre-built and staggered. And so once one thing comes on stage, gets pushed to the back, the next thing gets pushed to the front, or things get taken off stage, etc. But yeah, that from my experience and what I've seen at the festivals that I've been at, that's how it tends to work. Thanks, everyone. I think that's me done. Thank you.